Hey there. Would you like fascism in your nation? Are you tired of democracy and not having people you don't like persecuted? Well, you may be in luck. If your nation has these traits, you too could get fascism into place in your nation. 1. Have lots of money in politics. The extremely wealthy of the Weimar Republic really hated the trade unionists and having to pay them a decent amount just to live. So on top of the conservatives, they pumped a lot of money into the Nazi Party. They thought that once Nazis got seats in power, they would become more moderate, because they actually had to rule and work with other people. This ended up backfiring, as that works with liberals and conservatives, but not with fascists. They become even more crazy once they have power. In the US, Citizens United has allowed the nearly unchecked flow of dark money from the very rich to influence elections. While this doesn't have much impact on a presidential election, it does have a powerful impact on state and local governments, as well as House races. As 3/4 of the states can call a constitutional convention, buying politicians on a state level could end up with very dire consequences. Number 2, have a consolidation of the media by the rich. During the Weimar Republic, some very rich people began buying up newspapers, and even at the trial of Hitler in 1923, liberal papers said he was charismatic, or was a harmless joke, while conservative papers treated him with sympathy. As time went on, papers were more and more consolidated, and it was easy for Nazis to take over and control media and the narrative. In America, 6 megacorporations own the majority of the news. One of them is deliberately used to lie for the right wing. Nearly 10 million Americans got all their news from Facebook, who paid for and showed news based on the number of clicks only. This allowed Russian trolls and bots to click and view fake stories, giving them way more views on Facebook than there ever should have been. Once you get this kind of consolidation, expect it to be easy to make truth partisan and the few opposition sides easy to dismiss. Number 3, have a strong persecution or betrayal myth, ignoring anything bad about your nation. Near the end of World War I, while Germany had no one invading them yet, they were tapped dry of munitions, and it was only a matter of time before the Western powers invaded them and took over. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and Chief of Staff Erich Ludendorff decided they needed to surrender. The Americans would not accept a surrender from a monarchy, so Kaiser Wilhelm had to abdicate and be replaced by a democracy. They forced Matthias Erzberger to sign the Treaty of Versailles and give a speech to the people about their surrender. They then vilified Erzberger as having stabbed Germany in the back and propagated a myth that Germany could have won if not for Erzberger and the Republicans selling the nation out to get rid of the king, even though there was zero way they could have ever won, as they were out of munitions. Erzberger ended up getting killed by an angry citizen, and this stabbed in the back myth, along with the onerous reparations put on them by France and Britain, fomented a lot of hate and resentment, especially in the lesser educated rural regions. After the Civil War, money that was raised to spend on veterans who fought for the South because they couldn't get help from the federal government because they had, committed treason, was instead used to pay writers to craft the myth of the lost cause with a romanticized antebellum South where all slaves were happy and cared for, and the federal government started the War of Northern Aggression to attack their states' rights and had nothing to do with slavery, an idea that was never mentioned until 20 years after the Civil War. The United Daughters of the Confederacy produced catechisms with this money, with call and response readings, so kids would learn and believe that the War of Northern Aggression had nothing to do with slavery and everything to do with states' rights. They also spent that veterans' money on thousands of memorials across the South to help spread this mythologized version of the past. So these statues are not only an offense to African Americans, who were former slaves, they're also a giant middle finger to the soldiers that money was supposed to go to, and General Lee himself, who spoke up against these types of shrines to war. In current America, there is a belief that America was great until NAFTA and globalization and immigration happened. They were stabbed in the back by global elites trying to weaken the US. It was actually the gutting of programs like affordable college and maintaining infrastructure and the social safety net post-Cold War that made NAFTA and opening trade with China so painful. Immigrants also have always been a good scapegoat when the economy is bad. Not to mention that automation has taken more jobs than NAFTA and China combined. You will note that Russia also has this kind of myth that is widely believed that the world has always been persecuting and against them. In the post-Soviet era, there is a little truth to this, but only because the capitalist market didn't favor them for no malicious reasons, leading to a bad recession for many years. Number 4, have an economic crash. The Weimar Republic was forced to pay draconian reparations to their victors. They began to see a light at the end of the tunnel near the end of the 20s, and then the global crash happened and things were terrible. That much financial stress and starvation drops IQ points and opens people up to more baser emotions by bypassing their logic. They also began to completely distrust the system as a whole. They became nihilistic, especially the younger generations. The Great Recession had a similar impact on the world with the rise of authoritarians and nationalists worldwide. Number 5, have a nihilistic young population with a ton of toxic masculinity. With no prospect or hope, and a German tradition of military service from 11 years old making you a man, when Prussia was just a mercenary state, the old ways were going away. They did everything they were supposed to do and the rules had changed on them, especially men. They felt they weren't getting what was owed to them. The only way to fix this was a strong leader and to destroy the scapegoats through glories of battles and bloodshed. This would regain their manliness and make the world all better. They engaged in violence, harassment, and terrorist activities. These days, these same people engage in trolling and harassment to the points of wrecking a person's life and forcing them to move thanks to doxing. They really hate the social justice movement and blame it for all society's ills as a Jewish globalist conspiracy. Number 6, have a powerful social justice movement. After World War I, the Weimar Republic became the most progressive nation in the world very quickly. They had one of the most progressive constitutions, representation of the cross-section of the population based on demographics in the Bundestag. Majority of voters were women because so many men had died in the war, and they had 10% female MPs in the Bundestag, and they had the first pro-gay and trans laws and studies in the world. Many of the books you will see Nazis book burning are books on trans research. Berlin was a hotbed of liberal and progressive sentiment and ideas. Authoritarians hated them, and the backlash was swift and fierce. Women having power, of course, took power away from men. All the bad things that happened were, of course, caused by women sticking their nose in men's businesses. This also weakened the old boys' clubs, which pissed men off to no end. At the end of the 20s, as the Depression happened, women began turning to nationalism and the values of Kinder, Küche, and Kirche, children, kitchen, and church. And as they got older, they were trying to stop their kids from being social justice activists, viewing it as a failed experiment of regret and equating it with all of the nation's financial woes. If you've been on the internet for a day, you'll see this all over the place. Anti-feminists, anti-LGBT, anti-trans, traditionalists angry at our strong social justice movement, and some claiming it poisons everything, and longing for a day when men weren't emasculated as they see it, even though it's just men and women being on more equal playing fields, and many men shunning the social BS around toxic masculinity and being psychologically healthier. The ones who are angry because they can't get laid, or can't say anything they want without a negative reaction. Most of whom are just adult, self-centered man-children women don't want because they offer nothing. ISIS and Al-Qaeda also target men who couldn't get laid for their recruitment, as women should be property, and it's the fact that they aren't that men can't get laid. Luckily, these alt-right neo-Nazi recruits we have now aren't nearly as dangerous compared with the Brown Shirts of Germany, many of whom were battle-hardened from World War I. Our Nazis are pretty lame and just whiny in real life. Some viewing social justice as a Jewish plot to help with white genocide. When this kind of ridiculous logical disconnect from facts and poor education on the rise of fascism exists, history is doomed to repeat it. Number 7, have authoritarian police and judges. Hitler and the National Socialist Party attempted the Beer Hall Putsch, or coup, in 1923, but it was shut down very quickly. The police treated them very well, but treated the anti-fascists brutally. In court, they were treated like the victims, and the people on trial were even holding loud conversations and asked politely to keep it down, while the anti-fascists were brought in shackles. Hitler and his party were found to be guilty of staging a coup, but were allowed to essentially live on house arrest in a nice castle of Landsberg prison with his friends for 1 year, where he could have visitors and where he wrote Mein Kampf. The police and judges were authoritarian and hated socialists and leftists worse than any fascist, so they always let the Nazis off with a slap on the wrist while being the absolute harshest against anyone who stood against them, especially on the left. Once Hitler realized he could get away with anything, he decided to go into politics. At the moment, police are treating alt-right like they're the victims of bullying, while cracking down on anti-fascist movements like they're pure evil. The courts have, for the most part, been finding the majority of anti-fascists not guilty, but Trump is doing his best to fix that by packing the courts with judges he likes to allow states to push through more draconian protest laws. If this is your nation, prepare to shout Heil soon. Number 8, having extreme partisanship based on city and rural regions. While cities were incredibly progressive, the rural regions felt ignored and isolated by the extremely fast progression of new ideas, many of them found absolutely blasphemous and offensive. Back then, rural and urban populations were pretty much equal, so there was an extreme partisanship between them. It's one of the many reasons why German conservatives were much more likely to work with Nazis than those dirty liberals. They believed they could control the Nazis, which is of course impossible. They also were mad at the loss of the monarchy more than people in cities swimming with new modern liberal ideas. These days, we're using antiquated laws, so in the Senate, 17% of the population in rural regions holds 50% of the power. Gerrymandering and our first-past-the-post two-party system also creates a disproportionate amount of power for the rural regions that shouldn't be as powerful. If you have this, you're on your way toward fascism. Number 9, have information overload. The Weimar government was set up to attempt to ensure bipartisanship. There were multiple parties, so they had to work together to form a government. If they couldn't form a government that could work together, they could easily dissolve the government and hold another election. This in theory was supposed to work, but with the level of partisanship in the government, it meant that they were constantly having elections. 3 in 1 year at the worst of it. People became exhausted and tired of the constant bickering and infighting and having to constantly be aware of the next election and who was running. This allowed the Nazi Party at one point to control 1/3 of the Bundestag at their highest point. In America, the internet came about, and for the first decade, it was a great way to get truth and ideas out, but also gave small platforms to misinformation groups or pseudoscience and conspiracy nuts. Russia realized they could easily use the internet to do what they were best at for their entire national existence going back to the end of the Mongol rule, and that is to spread misinformation, foment infighting between their various enemies, and let them take each other down so they didn't have to. They began upvoting and promoting and spreading and sharing every piece of pseudoscience and conspiracy garbage they could find on the internet, so untrue stuff looked just as valid as real verified stuff. This created an overload of information. This created the post-truth era. Also because of this, places like YouTube and Facebook that monetize their comment suddenly had a rise of views and likes and cash flow to people saying the most terrible and horrible things and spreading the worst ideas. This caused even more people to jump on this gravy train. Now the majority doesn't believe in reality that is factual, but all believe something different and distrust any expert who tells them otherwise. If this happened in your nation, you will have people goose-stepping in no time. Number 10, have a split left wing and conservative enablers. While the communists and leftists hated the Nazis and conservatives, they also hated liberals. They were supported by the Soviet Union and viewed anything that could jam up government to be a good thing. So when the left was in power, they couldn't get anything done, so then the right could win. In this election, what should have been a congenial race between Bernie and Hillary supporters, thanks to Russia, ended up being a miserable and angry time as trolls and bots for either side acted absolutely horrible to the other side. Around 1/3 Russian and the rest alt-righters, spreading lies about the other side and making the sides hate each other, to the point that 10% of Berners voted for Trump just out of spite, and another 10% didn't vote because it was all rigged and in their mind Trump and Hillary were essentially the same, thanks to all the fake news and in-group misinformation circling the internet. The Weimar Republic conservatives also helped and formed governments with the Nazis, thinking they could control them and ended up regretting it after the Night of the Long Knives, along with the brown shirts. They helped Hitler push and break rules and norms of the Constitution to the breaking point and ended up purging 1/3 of the Bundestag as criminals for being communists. Once that happened, anyone who wouldn't vote with the Nazi Party to change the Constitution to make Hitler the Führer were threatened with violence and their families killed, as thanks to the Reichstag fire, which was most likely set by a Nazi, was blamed on a communist. Hitler had martial law and suppressed anti-fascists, but let brown shirts do whatever they wanted, including threaten violence and hold MPs' families hostage for votes. We now have an authoritarian kleptocrat in the White House pushing on every law and norm he can, breaking every rule to protect himself, and a Congress who caters to his every whim, and a Supreme Court illegally won that could change the U.S. laws forever, especially election laws. We have all of these things and are on track to either a better nation, but with a ton of rebuilding after this disaster, or full-on fascism. It all comes down to if and how you vote. Please listen to the Behind the Bastards podcast. It's a podcast on weird things about dictatorships, but it also goes into a great deal on how dictators seize power, which is usually pretty boring and systematic, and there must be fertile soil for the seeds to grow. And we are so fertile for fascism, especially the one titled Non-Nazi Bastards Who Helped Hitler Rise to Power. Also check out the Rewboss video listed below on how Hitler used the German parliament as chancellor to seize unlimited power from a democracy. We all know that Hitler did terrible things after he came to power, but we must educate ourselves on how he came to power in the first place if we don't want this to happen again.